I rise to talk about an issue that, while we are riveted in our attention, yes, about a good education bill, which I intend to support, and about the challenge of ISIL and terrorism, both abroad and at home, I am concerned that in the midst of all of those challenges, Iran is well on its way to once again defying the international community in a way that I think is incredibly dangerous. We are told that Iran is to be considered a trustworthy member of the international community, and that we should be able to abide or count on it to abide by the international commitments they have made and by UN Security Council resolutions. Well, on October 11th of this year, Iran tested a precision-guided long-range ballistic missile in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. And now Iran has carried out a new medium-range ballistic missile test in breach of 2 UN Security Council resolutions. We are told by Western intelligence that that test was held November 21st. The first one was October 11th. Now a second one on November 21st near Chabahar, a port city in southeast Iran's Sistan and Baluchistan province near the border with Pakistan. And the launch took place from a known missile test site along the Gulf of Oman. The missile, which is known as a Ghadar-110, has a range of anywhere between 1,800 and 2,000 kilometers, or about 1,200 miles, and is capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. The missile fired in November is an improved version of the Shahab-3 and is similar to the precision-guided missile tested by Iran on October the 10th, which elicited strong condemnation by members of the UN Security Council, but those condemnations were in word, but not in actions. Because what has happened as a result of Iran violating the UN Security Council resolutions as it relates to missile testing? Absolutely nothing. We're still debating at the Security Council on how to respond to Iran's last test in October. And I truly believe that actions speak louder than words, and American and UN actions demonstrate to me that with no activity that is visible to anyone as it relates to finding some consequence for Iran violating UN Security Council resolutions, Iran can support terror, Iran can develop its nuclear program, Iran can foment sectarian conflict across the Middle East, it can support Assad in its deadly regime against its people, it can test ballistic missiles, it can tell Iraq not to accept U.S. Special Forces in our fight against ISIL, and yet it will be rewarded with a multi-billion-dollar sanctions relief this coming year. Something is wrong because the silence is so deafening. Now, back in October of this year, after Iran launched its first missile test in violation of Security Council resolutions, I wrote to the Secretary of State. And I want to read excerpts of that letter because they are still more poignant today in view of the second test that is taking place against international will. I said, Mr. Secretary, the recent test launch of a precision-guided long-range ballistic missile by Iran was a violation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1929. As we discussed during your July 23rd appearance before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that resolution stipulates that Iran cannot presently engage in activities related to ballistic missiles. But with the October 11th launch, Iran has done so. on several levels, whether it's to research, development, planning, concealing, or launching this reportedly new technology. And as some of my colleagues on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee have pointed out in separate correspondence to you, Iran's violations of UN Security Council Resolution 1929 have become common. The Iranian regime is drawing a line in the sand that demonstrates, I believe with malice, that it will only selectively meet its obligations with respect to internationally sanctioned weapons programs. So what meaningful steps will the administration take to respond to the latest Iranian provocation? As Iran is prone to do, I view this as a test of American commitment and resolve, which I believe must be met with a decisive response in the language that Iran understands, that for every action there is a consequence. And I went on in that letter to say, I write to recommend to you that you use the administration's discretionary authority to tighten the full range of sanctions available to you to penalize Iran for violating Security Council 1929. From your responses, I said at the July 23rd Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing, I understand that tightening sanctions for non-nuclear related infractions would not violate the terms of the Iran nuclear agreement, even if it were presently in its full implementation phase, which it is not. The administration should also encourage P5+1 partners to respond with similar measures. Does the administration plan to use its current authority to tighten available sanctions against Iran? Iran is not only testing the administration, it's also testing our international partners. The launch, coordinated on the same day that Iran's parliament approved the general outline of the Iran nuclear agreement, should send a clear signal to the United States, the P5+1, and the UN Security Council that Iran's nuclear program and its weapons are linked, and the Iranian regime has every intention of maintaining the status quo. The administration should lead the P5+1 and the Security Council to respond swiftly, decisively, and unapologetically. The series of test launches of Iran ballistic missiles have led us to the point as part of a larger weapons development program that, when taken together with Iran's history of deception, its opaque nuclear capabilities, its past violations of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, its fiery rhetoric, destabilizing activities throughout the region, and well-documented malign intent, requires a strong international response. And particularly, I know the time to act was then, and now again is certainly now, before Iran can exploit UN Security Council 2231, because that particular resolution failed to incorporate the same mandatory language that Security Council 1929 had. So in 1929, the world said you cannot conduct ballistic missile tests and work on the development of ballistic missiles. When we struck the deal with Iran, we went to a different language where we strongly called upon Iran not to do so for the next 8 years. But strongly calling upon a country from the Security Council not to do something is not prohibiting those threatening activities. So we do have sanctions that are in place in a Security Council resolution that is in place, because the deal has not gone into full effect until implementation takes place, where Iran is already violating the international will as expressed by those Security Council resolutions. And I would argue that in addition to the fact that they are defying the will of the international community as it relates to their missile weapons program, which can carry a nuclear warhead, I think that they are testing the will of the international community when it comes to the question of how serious will we be about violations of the nuclear agreement. And the sooner that we are stronger in our response to their violations of the Security Council resolutions on missile technology and missile weapon systems, the sooner that they will understand that we will not allow them to ultimately violate the agreement that we struck with them as it relates to their nuclear program, and that if they do, there are serious consequences. Iran has tested the world. I followed Iran when I first was in the House of Representatives, and it came to my knowledge that the United States was sending voluntary contributions to the International Atomic Energy Administration above and beyond our membership dues. And when I inquired as to what was that for, it ended up to help the IAEA help Iran create operational capacity at the Bushehr nuclear facility. Well, that wasn't in the national interest of the United States, and certainly not in the national interest and security of our ally, the State of Israel. And I led a successful drive to stop those voluntary contributions in the House. And from that day, in my early beginning of my House career, I followed Iran because I said, why does a country that has such huge, I think it's the fourth largest oil reserves and right up there as it relates to gas reserves, need nuclear power for domestic energy consumption? It doesn't. And I have followed Iran since then, and I have seen that by testing the international community's will at every step of the way, they advanced their nuclear program till it came to the point, almost like our too big to fail banks. Well, this was too big to stop, so we tried to manage it. And now they are testing the world as it relates to their missile technology and missile weapons program. And again, we see a lack of response. My letter to the Secretary of State on October 19th, which also separately there was a series of letters by other colleagues about the same issue, has not been responded to. So we are going on 2 months since this action took place, and there is silence. And as a matter of fact, the only thing I've read is press reports about the latest violation, but I haven't seen the administration say a word about it. And so if the Iranians get the sense that you can go ahead and violate the international will as expressed through Security Council resolutions and face no consequence as a result thereof, then based upon history, you're going to face an Iran that is going to test the international community as it relates to its commitments in the Iran nuclear program. And if we do not send a strong message now, we are only inviting attempts to violate that agreement. So I'm very much of the belief that, one, you violated the international agreements, you have to have a consequence just on that basis, because we are told when we were having the great debate about the Iran deal that no, this is just about the nuclear program, that human rights violations, that weapons violations, that violations in terms of their activities to destabilize the region and their hegemonic interests, that we were going to push back on all of those things. Well, I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that. And that to me invites a great risk. So I urge the administration to act decisively, to pursue both in the Security Council and apart from the Security Council with our P5+1 allies, sanctionable items that can be outside of the nuclear portfolio, that can send a very strong message to Iran that don't think that you can get away with these types of actions and have no consequence. And secondly, I seriously believe that this is another example of why the Iran Sanctions Act that I helped author and was passed overwhelmingly in the United States Senate and expires this coming year needs to be reauthorized. Because if there is a belief that there will be no sanctions in place as a result of any violations that take place, what are we snapping back to? What are we snapping back to? So I believe there is nothing wrong with at least having those sanctions reauthorized and the Iranians having an understanding that if they violate the agreement, there are sanctions to snap back to. What they're doing in their violations of Security Council resolutions as it relates to missile weapons programs is already a bellwether of, I believe, what their actions will be if they ultimately do, if we do not ultimately meet the test of their challenge. And they are testing us. This is the same Iran that I saw for years test the international will, being told it cannot advance its nuclear program to the point that it got to such an extent that we struck a deal. That is the risk that we face here. So I look forward to pursuing a robust response to Iran. For all of my colleagues who supported the agreement, this is actually something that we should be in chorus together on, to ensure that Iran has a very clear message that we intend to push back on you. You cannot violate the international norm. And by doing so, hopefully we will see the performance of an agreement that is supposed to control their nuclear program in a way that does not risk the world's security. That's what's at stake in this regard. I'll close by simply saying, if you pass by the archives building, over its portal, there is this statement: what is past is prologue. I hope that that statement is in the reality as we face the challenge of an Iran that feels stronger within the region, that creates greater instability through its support of Hezbollah, that supports Assad and continues a civil war in which thousands and thousands are dying, creating the rise of ISIS at the end of the day by a state that is virtually a failed state at this point in time, and that can put undue influence on its neighbor Iraq, a country for which we have said shed so many lives and national treasure. Something is wrong in that equation, and I hope my colleagues will wake up to it, will join us in an effort to try to make sure that we push back in a way that is not only appropriate and within the international order, but necessary if we truly do not want Iran to achieve nuclear power for nuclear weapons. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor.